let us transition here. I'm seeing we lost some followers, viewers rather. That's okay. We're going to transition here to talking about anime, but that's probably good because what I'm about to get into is very arcane, and it's the normies, the people who are kind of on the edge. They might not be able to appreciate this like I think a lot of you guys will be. We talk about the perennial tradition of Japan, and I think as we know, the logos, which is to say, that which is Christ. Christ is the incarnate form of the logos, the word. But of course, as I believe it was Fulton Sheen says, the aboriginal form of God, of Christ, the logos, exists in our own conscience as the natural law compels. Is someone playing? Okay, good. It's not. I'm hearing things. As the natural law, which acts as this external motivator for us to do the right thing. And so even those people who may not be privy or invincibly ignorant to the sacraments or to God's church can be tacitly, implicitly connected to them. And I've read through the explicit part of the catechism where it talks about this on my show. By following the conscience they're following their conscience, by following the natural law that's written on their hearts. You can read this in Romans 1. Paul talks about Gentiles who before God revealed himself to the whole human race, opened up all the sacraments to them back when there was just Judaism. There were still Gentiles who were saved, and Paul explicitly says this. He talks about how they followed the conscience written on their own hearts. And so we see these echoes, basically, of logos throughout different civilizations throughout history. And this isn't perfectly in line with, and I'm prefixing my whole conversation about this because we're talking about a pagan religion. And I want to make it clear to people that I'm not pagan, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about this in like a serious fashion about there are implications of this particular pagan form, which is Shintoism on Japan. And why it can still be, I guess you could say, based or have based impulses. And so even Unitatis, I want to make sure I say this right. Unitatis Redente Gratio, the Vatican II document explicitly says that God has worked in other various civilizations in there and has even manifested his grace in various ways to them. And so we can, appreciate some of how the similarities between Christianity and we see them naturally sprung up in various other world religions. That is what interested me in perennial traditionalism. And so, of course, tonight we're talking about the perennial tradition that is undergirded Japan, or rather the religion that's undergirded Japan that stems from the perennial tradition, which, like I mentioned, is Shintoism, and to a minor extent Zen Buddhism, but I'm not going to talk about that as much, because that generally the Buddhism of Japan concerns only the afterlife, and I wouldn't say that to some extent maybe that affects anime, but I think that the virtues of Shintoism, and particularly the lore of Shintoism, are a much bigger factor. So we'll see how deep I want to go. We'll see how deep you guys want me to go. So we'll see here. Ballot measure passes by unanimous consent, says King Roy. I don't want to think about politics right now. I'll look at it another time. We'll look at it another time. That's big news right there. That's interesting. I don't know. I'm curious now. You rail my conversation. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe no one does want to talk about anime and Shinto and whatever. But whatever. King Grip says Jake Lloyd thinks pagan gods and other societies are misinterpreted. Angels, demons make sense. Yeah, I would. Okay, I'm all right. Good. I'm not. I was gonna say something to that extent, but I was worried that I would lose my audience here because people would say, "Oh, he's giving too much ground to paganism." I would say that. I would say that there is. All right, let's just start from the beginning. Fuck it. So in Shintoism, there's to something like that extent. I would say they're imperfect. These other religions are imperfect receptacles of the truth. And in Shintoism in particular, what we see is they had this, what they called the Ame no Mina Kanushi no Kami. Kami is the word for God, and that meant something to the extent of the God, the Lord who is at the center of heaven. And so this was like the first, I guess, foundational God, and he was the only God who engendered himself. In other words, he was this divine cosmic principle that all other gods are basically enclosed under. It's like this umbrella effect. All of the other gods are enclosed under, or kamis, which might be better interpreted as spirits, but they're all under this one. They're all basically been engendered through some lineage stemming from this one, basically the equivalent of like the unmoved mover in our Western tradition. And just as in our Western tradition, we have the unmoved mover, and from the unmoved mover comes all order and logic and sensibility. And just as the order and logic manifests itself in various ways in mathematics and science, and even in metaphysics, we see things like change. We make sense of change through Aristotelian principles like act and potency. Other societies viewed things like this, and they attributed in the same way we might attribute some of these orderly principles to God. And they've been basically just like engendered from God. They stem from, the logos. In the same way, they see these principles in nature, and particularly for Shintoism, they're very much interested in nature, the beauty of nature. They see these beautiful parts of nature, and they basically see that there's some cosmic principle behind that, and they anthropomorphize that cosmic principle. And they take this metaphysical principle and they create basically a spirit out of that, and they basically it has some spiritual connection. And I don't think that's unreasonable, and I think that it's been a detriment to the Western society that we've lost the spiritual connection that we used to have with the metaphysical. It used to be a long-standing tradition in the West to accept things like alchemy and astrology, not because they were like white girl retard, superstitious things, but because we believe that there was, in fact, some connection between the metaphysical, particularly as it related to the spiritual, and the physical. And so we see objects as they exist, but we don't see how they exist in and of themselves. We only see objects as they exist presented to us in our five senses. We see them as they're given in space, time, and all these other principles, but we don't see how they exist outside of us. And we know that outside of us, through reason, we can kind of have these metaphysical principles, like I mentioned from Aristotle, but we can also, I think, connect them to this spiritual principle as well. And so basically in Shinto, they basically have created these symbols, which is, again, this anthropomorphization of these different spirits to represent these principles that they do think have some spiritual significance. Does that make sense, what I just said there? And so, yeah, so far I think that everyone kind of sees where I'm coming from. And so the Ame no Mina Kanushi no Kami, he created the first two men and women who were considered to be first man was Izanagi, and the first woman was Izanami. And they're very similar to the first people in the West, or Christianity, Adam and Eve. You guys are saying a lot. Let me just see. Okay, look, if you have a lot of questions, Kami is pronounced Kami. I am saying it as Kami. What? Ame is not Kami. Ame is A-M-E. Ame no Mina Kanushi no Kami. I said it right. No, you're the baka. You're the baka, not me. You the baka. Okay. If you have too esoteric, some people are saying, someone's saying white Shinto, mean, based, or cringe. White Shinto? No, that's cringe. It's only understandable if you're Japanese, why you'd want to be Shinto, because that's the religion that is adapted to your society. White people should be Catholic. They shouldn't be even pagans. And the Evola was a total LARPer, thinking that paganism was still part of the European psyche. He's less of even of a LARPer than some of the people who are the wingnet pagans. At least Evola said you shouldn't actually worship pagan gods, just retain the pagan traditions. But notwithstanding, if you have a lot of questions, if you don't mind, just keep them to the end. So that way I can just answer them all succinctly, and don't lose my train of thought. Thank you guys, appreciate that. Don't leave though. This is important. I gotta build up a little bit, but once we get there, it's we have to work a lot. We have to grind, but the profit is big. You'll learn so much. Your brain will expand tonight. Okay, all right. So first humans, Izanami Izanagi. Izanagi is the man. He represents everything in existence. He represents this like existential plane, and he represents kind of like this pure metaphysics. And then Izanami represents nature. That's his consort, and she represents the natural world and its beauty. And to some extent, there's something ethereal to like nature, but it's also still contingent. But according to the tradition, Izanami kind of deceived Izanagi into thinking that she was like fully, I guess you could say, divine like he was, and there was no part of her that was contingent. There's no contingency. And so again, we see a case in which the woman is the first one that fucks up, basically. Basically, the woman in this case has what Fritjof Schuon calls the deifugal tendency. Dei meaning God, fugal meaning to flee or to resist God. You see that tendency come up once again, and it's from the seductive nature of the woman that we see this arise. And now Izanagi doesn't know this. They have a child. They have several children together. One of the children, I believe, is the god of fire. And giving birth to the god of fire, Izanami burns herself and ends up dying. She goes to hell and becomes the queen of the underworld, basically. And Izanagi's like, where the hell did she go? Oh, yeah, where did she go? What happened? And the parallel is actually really interesting to think about. If Izanami is supposed to be like Eve, and then of course in our tradition, the Virgin Mary is the opposite of Eve. The Virgin Mary, just as Eve sinned, Mary like obeyed God, and just as Izanami went to hell, like became the queen of the underworld basically because of her deception. The Virgin Mary ascended into heaven and was made queen of heaven. So you start seeing these interesting connections, and then basically, I didn't really understand exactly why, but Izanagi was told don't look at Izanami's look for Izanami, because like he would see her dead corpse and realize that she was contingent, and he saw it anyway, and basically their nakedness was exposed. Her nakedness as a contingent being, as nature, as something that passes and withers, as something that has an element of disequilibrium to it, was exposed for Izanami or Izanagi. And then when Izanami heard about this, was very upset and got all like the demons in hell together to like go to war with Izanagi. But then Izanagi dropped a giant boulder on top of like the gate of hell, so they're all trapped in there apparently, something of that sort. So obviously we see some parallels to Adam and Eve, but also some things that are just very different. The biggest, of course, being that the two were had some divine aspect to them. The two were also the ones who created the islands of Japan. It was said that the Izanagi had this giant stirring spoon, and they stood on the celestial bridge. And that is why in anime and in Japanese culture, you'll see these arches. You'll see a lot of arches in shrines. If you've watched Weathering with Me, wherever the shrine appeared, it would always have this arch. It's called the Torii, I believe. And the arch represents the celestial bridge that Izanagi stood on. And using this phallic type of image, he stirred together the ocean with Izanami, and then out popped Japan. And then they were the first people who gave birth to the Japanese race, the Yamato race. And so that's kind of the conception point. Izanagi later goes on to have 2 children of his own, just by himself, I guess through meiosis or whatever. And one of those is represented as the Tempest, or the god of the spirit of the moon, and is represented by disequilibrium and storms, tsunamis, things like that. I believe his name was Susanoo wo no Mikoto. And then the creative intellect, the ethereal beauty was the sun goddess, who was Amaterasu Omikami. You don't need to worry about the names, but basically she represented the creative intellect of God, and so it was actually from her line that the first emperor was believed to have descended. And so that is why the Japanese people have always had this very keen sense of self-consciousness is because they believe that the emperor descends straight from their, like, the sun goddess. Straight from the sun goddess comes the first emperor, Jimmu Tenno. I think that's how you say his name, Jimmu Tenno. He was like the first emperor of Japan, and he was supposed to unite all the different tribes of Japan. He was supposed to unite them all together, or remind them that they are this great Yamato race that descended from, the first two spirits, I guess you could say. And so that is why he was never to be touched. In a similar way as, like, the Pope has the charism of God when he sits on the chair of Peter, the same way the Pharisees had the seat of Moses, but it was temporary. The emperor kind of has that for his whole life. And which is why the emperor was never to be touched. And it was very interesting when Douglas MacArthur, this is just kind of an interesting factoid, Douglas MacArthur, when they landed, when the Japanese surrendered after World War II, he went and shook Emperor Hiroto's hand, and it was like a big deal. Like, the Japanese advisors in the room thought it was totally scandalous, and they were wanting to raise all hell, but the emperor knew they had lost and wasn't going to, like, make a big deal out of it, and probably understood it was just a cultural thing. And so then he kind of, like, just waved them back. I saw, like, a movie on it with the one guy from Men in Black, but I think it was called The Emperor. It was a good movie. Anyway, so yeah, it was a big deal when they shook his hand, and so that has always kind of been with the Japanese people, is that sense of racial consciousness. And we see in anime, it's usually very homogenous. If it's an anime that's slice of life, very rarely you'll have, like, maybe you'll once in a while, I've seen, like, an American, but they never have, like, a Chinese, explicitly Chinese person or anything like that. Or even, like, black person, right? So there's a very strong sense of ethnic consciousness in Japan, because that's of course permeated into anime, which just reflects that back. I would also, I guess, point to I'm trying to think some other good examples how that has appeared in anime. I think there's a strong sense of nationalism in some animes. For example, Kaguya-sama Love is War. There was a strong sense of nationalism. Particularly, they had this nationalism for their school. They would sing this, like, this almost micro-nationalism, but the application, I think, was still broader. There was also, I forget the anime. There's this one anime that's very similar to, like, magical, like, kind of magical girl anime, like Puff Girl. I think everyone kind of knows the magical girl animes. I saw one where, like, this one person was explicitly, like, this Japanese nationalist. And so, nationalism in Japan is not seen as racist the same way it is seen here. It's seen as probably pretty normal. And while I would say most of the Japanese people have kind of lost, a lot of these Shinto traditions consciously, it still subconsciously is a part of their, like, zeitgeist. And since they don't have, a media that's controlled by a rootless, transient group, Hollywood, like, because, we have, the Jews who are not American, but they, of course, their entertainment industry is controlled by the Japanese. So, of course, it's going to be made for the Japanese and going to have Japanese iconography and symbolism and representation. And so that's why anime has that base part of it. And we don't see a political liberal agenda for the most part in anime, the same way we definitely see it in Western films. We're definitely trying to convey a particular bias. And if there is ever a bias in anime, like I mentioned, it's always going to be probably towards mostly the nationalist side. And if the only two times I've ever seen, like, an anime with, like, a liberal bias has always been, I think, a mistranslation. One time there was an anime called Miss Koyabashi Dragon Maid, and there's one line where this one dragon girl who has these absolutely just ginormous milkers, okay? All right, good. Looks like you guys are still paying attention. I was hoping I didn't lose anyone, all right? So yeah, kind of like Sailor Moon, exactly. like Sailor Moon. That's the magical girl anime I was talking about. So this one dragon has giant milkers that are, you know, very lascivious, and so she doesn't dress very modestly. And so I think near the end of the anime, she does dress modestly, and she's asked why, and she says something to the effect of like, "Oh, I don't want to distract men," and it was translated by Fun Animation as "I'm submitting to the patriarchy," something really cringe in SJW. And so a lot of people thought, "Oh, look, anime's being cringe," but no, it was actually just a mistranslation. I saw another Funimation anime where this one guy said he was gay, a character said he was gay. I think it was called like The Stars Align. It was kind of a dumb anime about sports, but and a character said he's gay, and another character says, "Oh yeah, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that." And I almost feel like that was probably either mistranslation or that anime was like not really a good representation of most animes, because there was like a fat girl in the anime. That's the other thing you'll notice. And I think it's important to the story I told about Izanami and Izanagi, is there's always been this concept of gender roles and gender hierarchy within Japan. This has always been understood. There is no like questions about, oh, you can be one gender today, another gender tomorrow, or gender fluidity. No, it's very understood what gender is, and there's understood the role of every gender, and that has always been pretty evident, I think, in anime. The female characters usually are the ones who cook. In Oremo, of course, you know, the way that the female characters that try to win the attention of the MC, the main character, was by saying, "Oh, I would." It was actually, I'll show you. It was this character here. She said, "Oh, I'll make you a bento box." There we go. This character here, my wallpaper for this month. She said, "I'll make you a bento box. I'll cook for you. I'll do all these things that represent traditional feminine values, feminine roles." And so that's very, you know, I think this is very distinct in anime. I think that oftentimes you'll miss it because it's just so natural that you'd expect it. You'd expect that to be the case. So you often miss, you know, these little things here and there, or the woman is like one cooking, or the one, she has like this desire to raise kids or something like that. So there is, of course, yeah, and then there's also the hierarchy, like I mentioned, because of course Izanami was the first one who kind of sinned, or brought the, I guess you could say she brought like the tempest into the world, and that is why there's that conflict between the solar goddess and then her brother, who represents the tempest, is because of this beginning conflict between Izanami and Izanagi. It kind of started from the very beginning. And so that's why in Japan, like, all their leaders are men. In the anime we were watching recently, what was it, Tonikaku Kawaii or whatever? I think the English is like Take Me to the Moon. That anime, the woman refers to her husband as like Dama-sama, and she uses the word sama to basically say, it is translated into Crunchyroll as darling. It's just like, you know, this expression of romantic feeling, or you can say affection. This statement of affection. But the man, he uses like I think uses just her name back, and doesn't use, of course, the sama. The sama is referencing someone who has a higher authority, references respect and awe towards that person. And in fact, in traditional Japanese culture, the women used to cut off or shave. Cut off sounds kind of grotesque. They would shave their eyebrows in traditional Japanese culture, and they would repaint them really high up on their forehead. And it looks really weird, but the reason why is because women were supposed to be emotionless. Women were supposed to be this vessel that is supposed to represent this feminine mystique. She's supposed to be like this tranquil, beautiful, fair, and she was not supposed to be like someone who gives into emotion easily. That was kind of like the image that was supposed to be portrayed there. And so that, again, this goes back to the baseness, you could kind of say, of anime is in this gender role. And even though there are anime characters who wear, they don't all wear dresses. I would say it's pretty predominantly that anime characters, especially in schools, and this is because in Japanese schools to this day, they still instill school uniforms, and they have a sense of professionalism. Men are supposed to act like men. They have to wear suits, or some, like, whatever their uniform is. and then women have to wear something that is with some dress or skirt, their own version. And that's how you know if there's like a Chinese school or Japanese school rather visiting, is because they all like are wearing uniform, and they're all wearing like these nice uniforms with jackets and ties, and like that's how I knew one was visiting my school. And yeah, I got some line numbers that day from the guys, of course. I got like met some cool people, some Japanese guys, talked to them. So yeah, that's again goes back to this very clear distinction between men and women and their various different role in society and in our civilization. And I think that's something that's based right wing, but people often take it for granted now, given the fact that women think they can be whoever they want, and there's like this blurring of the genders. I think that women have the same aptitudes for roles of leadership or same like intellectual aptitudes as men, those type of things. Japanese women are stoic, asked Grumpy. Yeah, that was kind of like supposed to be the idea, is they're supposed to be very stoic, and that's kind of represented the virtue of the woman was supposed to be there in her steadfastness. And again, that goes back to like the solar goddess was there as a steadfast picture against the tempest which was raging against her, which was her brother. And in fact, she went into hiding, the solar goddess, into like this cliff. When she came out of hiding, she gave a mirror to the first emperor and basically said like, oh, when you look into this, you will see my face or something like this, and you'll be always reminded of me. And I wonder at times if that was like an apparition of the Virgin Mary, was this solar goddess, because there is pictures of the Virgin Mary carrying a mirror, and in the picture of the Virgin Mary, the mirror is carrying is like supposed to reflect that Mary, when we see Mary, we're thinking of God, and that's why she's like this mirror. And so the same way, like the Amaterasu Omikami was trying to remind people that they would see God through this mirror. So to some extent, I would be interested in that hypothesis, particularly since there are miracles that are attributed to her. I believe it was like I don't know if I think it was the Chinese or something. They were invading Japan, and their ships were blinded by the mirror that she had. She came out of heaven, according to Shinto lore, and had the mirror and blinded the ships, and they all crashed against the rocks, saving Japan from invasion. Yeah, it was very similar to pagan Rome, that's true. It was also similar to pagan Rome in the sense that the samurai had young like men that they often hired, and there was like, from what I heard, there was instances of like them that being in a sexual relationship, which is not based, obviously. I know, having wholesome platonic male relationships is fine, but the sexual angle, of course, yeah, not so great. But today, Japan is pretty homophobic, so that's based. So regardless of what it was in like the feudal age, today Japan, like I saw like one video of this guy interviewing the Japanese people about homosexuality. Some of them were saying that they didn't like it because they didn't produce children, and I think that again goes back to the traditional gender roles. They see women are supposed to produce children, and then of course one other person said it's disgusting. And that probably goes to the Shinto virtue of purity. And that's probably what I'll get into next here. Was there anything more about the lore that I wanted to talk about? Oh, one more thing I wanted to say about the anime characters is that the most defining feature of a woman anime character is her eyes. Almost always, women anime characters will have large eyes. Men will have squinty eyes. There are exceptions. Usually younger men might have larger eyes, younger boys. But very rarely do women have squinty eyes. But there are exceptions, but generally speaking, that's probably the best and easiest way to determine if a character's a man or a woman, is the eye shape, which is very interesting and noticed. Some people notice this and point it out to me. And again, I think the big eyes accentuate kind of the cute factor. Accentuate the innocent factor, and that goes back to virtue, which I'll get into and I'll talk about that. But the fact that they differentiate the women characters from the male characters. Squinty eyes kind of representing a serious person, someone who's wants to get something done, whereas the large eyes kind of represents innocence and are supposed to be more femininity. I think that's very strong in anime. It's very represented there. That is why I've often said that the anime character is like the form, like the platonic form of the human, because they find these characteristics that we find visually attractive, appealing. Objectively, I think there is an objective study of aesthetics, and they are able to accentuate them. And so that's why, you know, we can say, like, you know, these are we are all just imperfect instantiations of the perfect anime character. But notwithstanding, and one of the probably the biggest red pills of anime is the virtues that are very subconsciously like tied in there. And the three big virtues of Shintoism were, and I wrote this down here, I want to make sure I get this right: truth or wisdom, courage or strength, and charity and compassion. So I'll go through the first one, truth or wisdom. And truth or wisdom was kind of breaking down into like two parts. One part was like sincerity, and by sincerity means that they understood ontology. They understood kind of the Nietzschean concept, become who you are. They understood like the natural law, the natural order of things, and the hierarchy. They understood that. The other side to it was purity, and that again was represented by the mirror that was in like the kind of the holy of holies of Shinto shrines, which are called jinjas. In the jinja, there was like this shrine with the mirror, which was either like a replica or they believe was like a representation of the one that was given to the first emperor. And the mirror represented kind of the purity. And we see that, I think, probably the most defined in Japanese culture. Not just like a mental purity and a moral purity, which we definitely see, but we also see a purity of cleanliness. That is another thing we see. And professionalism, I think, to some extent, is like a purity of attire. We don't see sloppiness. And when it comes to like when it comes to purity of cleanliness, it's hard to beat the Japanese. You know, they take off their shoes before they enter into their house. They keep, you know, their cities very clean. I think if you compare like Tokyo, this giant city, one of the largest in the world, to New York City or to Philadelphia or Atlanta, then these places are like shitholes. And I mean, you can, I think there's, you know, a demographic angle to it for sure. But, you know, it's part of the Japanese tradition to keep things very clean and orderly. And, you know, maybe that's just me as an autist. I really appreciate that. But, yeah, I feel like that's part of, you know, that's part of like their traditions. And then it's reflected, I think, in anime. And to some extent, you'll see those traditions being played out. And yeah, I think someone is talking about like the innocence here. They said the big eyes, the open, innocent, accepting squint. The squint is hardened, closed, defended. Exactly. That's the anime physiognomy. Right. Exactly right, King Gripe. And the innocent look, the purity look, that goes to that Shinto virtue, basically. It's like it kind of stems from that. That is, its progenitor was this virtue in Shintoism that was taught from child to child all the way down the line. And even though today only around, I think it's like 3% of Japanese people identify as Shinto, I think it's like 20% identify as Buddhist, which the Buddhism of Japan is combined with Shintoism, basically. But 70% of the Japanese, 70%, and to give you some perspective around, I think it's less than 70% of Americans claim to be Christian. And a lot of Americans claim to be Christian. But around 70% of Japanese go to the shrine every year on New Year's, and they do like some of those Shinto traditions. They will still, like, you know, pray to the local kami of the jinja, the shrine. And so they're not like the material atheist of China. They don't have that mentality. They still, they might not, you know, consciously believe in some of these things, but subconsciously these attitudes are still present. And yes, the purity of women is definitely there. And we saw this with, I think, a lot of animes. They kind of make a joke out of it where like a guy trips and accidentally grabs a woman's bosom. And like then the woman freaks out and makes like a big deal and hits him or something like that. And they make a joke out of it, but, you know, underlying that is still the concept that, you know, there shouldn't be touching a woman there. And the anime that we are watching together, Fly Me to the Moon, this guy gets really embarrassed when he holds his girlfriend's hand because he feels like this is lecherous almost. This is like this act of lechery, holding his girlfriend's hand in public, because, again, they were raised in this culture of purity. So yeah, it's essentially spiritism, says Sacred Groiper. Yes, kind of. Yeah, this is like the spirit of the local shrine. You're right. It's spiritism. Exactly, King Groip. Yeah, very well done. Good job. King Roimp with the great analysis there. Yeah, no lewd handholding. They need to ban that. But and Japan has stricter pornography laws than the United States does. They require that any pornography, which they define as showing genitalia, must be censored, and they're pretty strict about that. I think they've gotten a little looser, maybe, but they are stricter than the United States. That's for sure. A lot stricter than Hollywood, because anime is meant for about our age group. There's anime meant for kids, but there's anime also meant for our age group. And anime is meant for our age group don't include. I mean, there might be like a few exceptions. Like, I can't even name any exceptions that aren't just straight hentai. They're like that like it would include, like, a scene that's like really explicitly sexual between two unmarried people or something like that. Like you would see in a lot of Hollywood movies, is basically what I'm getting at. The juxtaposition between anime and the Western films is insane. I was watching, like, I've mentioned this many, many times on my show here, but just so that I have it one more time said, I was watching, was it the show called, I think it was called, like, Polar? It's the show about, like, this train. And, they're living on this train. It's this dystopian film. And there's like a character that like there's like these security guards. 2 of the 3 are gay. There's another gay person who was like this rich bourgeois guy, and they make it very explicit they're gay. They show them doing these very gross acts, or at least they imply it very explicitly, and it's disgusting. And like I couldn't believe it when I was like, "Is this literally what like modern television looks like?" Because I haven't watched anything. The most modern show I've watched probably is like The Office, and even then you see a lot of the hookup culture, and there's no emphasis on getting married before you should have intercourse and those type of things. And then of course we have the other Shinto virtues of courage or strength. We see this in a lot of shonen animes. There's a strong sense of duty on the side of men, and that's why you have people like Atoya Yamaguchi. I'm not gonna get into the Atoya Yamaguchi question. If you don't know, he was the guy who stabbed the socialist leader, basically preventing socialism from taking over Japan like it did in China. I'm not gonna comment too much on that though. That for the sake of optics. But yeah, I don't endorse any political violence, at least here and now. So I just want to say that right now, off the bat. But you saw like a really strong sense of duty to the emperor and to his country, and courage till death. He ended up killing himself in his cell, wrote on the wall with toothpaste, "Long live the emperor. Would that I have 7 lives to give for my nation," which was from a samurai quote. And the samurai, I forget the name, was also like the patron saint, basically, of kamikaze pilots. And kamikaze pilots basically went there with this strong sense of duty that Japan was in her last days, and she should fight for the emperor, or he should fight for the emperor until the bitter end. And it's better to die with honor than it is to surrender and to dishonor, this centuries of ancestors that have come before you. You're this great people that descend from the gods. Your emperor descends directly from the sun goddess herself. You don't want to defile your nation like this by giving up. The virtue of courage and strength have been instilled in them since the days of the samurai. Of course, they had the Bushido Code. And one of the things that I love about the Bushido Code is it talks about strength through courtesy. That the samurai are still supposed to be they're not supposed to be wild, or like this conception of this is probably somewhat, I don't know how often this was actually played out, but this is the ideal was the samurai was supposed to be tempered, disciplined, and use their strength for good to help people, protect those who are weaker, to protect the shogun, and to fight for the emperor. And the classic, I guess you could say, their dictum was, a samurai should be cold like his sword, but never forget the fire whence it was forged. It's just so beautiful and poetic. And yeah, anyone who watches shonen animes can definitely see this. Demon Slayer is a great anime that takes place in the Taisho period, and you see a strong sense of duty on the part of Tanjiro to protect his sister Nezuko, who is actually the Dakimakura right behind me. He feels like this really compelling sense of duty to protect his family member, and that's why he becomes a Demon Slayer and does like a, goes through all the rigorous training. If you watch the anime, you'll see like how hard the training was. Bushido is an analog to chivalry. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Yeah, you see a lot of analogs between medieval Europe and feudal Japan and Hindu India and the dynasties of China and even some Islamic cultures. So we see all these similarities throughout the world, and again, it's the perennial tradition manifesting itself in different societies and their various, various forms, the way they've adapted themselves to the tradition. But yeah, it's exactly right, Secret Viper. It's their code of chivalry, basically. Someone says, my friend recommended I watch The Magicians with my parents. Legit has a girl watching her parents have an orgy. I've never seen that anime, but so like I said, it's not an anime. Okay, The Magicians would sound like something that might be an anime because they really like the fantasy theme in anime, the medieval fantasy. Oh my goodness, yeah, I've never seen this anime, but wow, okay. So this is like a peak modern show right there. Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. So yeah, circumvent the Jewish hegemony of Hollywood by watching anime. Entertaining and based is what I'm getting at here. I wanted to just briefly say about the ancestral thing. There's kind of like this ancestral worship where they see their ancestor is like when they're born, they see themselves as like in this perfect state of harmony and tranquility with their own nature, and as they have passions and inclinations, they start to go down. They have certain vices that they'll engage in, and later, when they die, when everyone dies, and they return to this like state of tranquility. And that's more probably where the Buddhism part comes in, is like they like return to like they have like some concept of like a reincarnation. Their spirit still exists out there. Sometimes I think they believe they sometimes become even communes, like spirits themselves. But anyway, the idea is that they get closer to God when they die. They're almost like the saints in Christianity, where we believe the saints have been beatified, or they've seen the beatific vision, the divinization of the soul, the theosis. I think it's Malktov, or in like Hindi. Basically, like they become like God, and you see that even in Shintoism. So that's why they have like a lot of like ancestral, like they see ancestors as like a big thing because they look to them as those who are really close to God, and those who have like gone before them, who have led the way. So that's one other part of the reason why they don't want to shame their ancestral line. They don't want to be the break, because they see all their ancestors are looking down from heaven, looking down and seeing what they're doing, and of course their ancestors are basically the equivalent of what we see as saints. So they're like, oh, we don't want to offend them or bring shame or dishonor to our family. So that's a big theme, and I think Americans would do good to think about their the history and stop becoming so myopic or nearsighted as a people. I think we'd do good as a civilization if we thought about how our ancestors, if they were looking down on us, how they would view our current state. Or even if like just the saints in general. I'm sure the saints are weeping over us, over the current state of our society. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about? Oh, and finally, charity and compassion are virtues in Shintoism. We see this, of course, in Christianity. So the idea, and this was said by one of the pagan guys who came on my show, he said that the charity and compassion of Christianity was unique to Christianity, and that paganism was a more rough religion, and that it was more like might makes right. And I don't know if that's true for European pagans. I haven't really done a lot of research in Celts and Norse. I don't really care because they're all extinct, but the religions are. But when it comes to like Shintoism, certainly that's not the case. Hinduism, that is not the case. Um, there's a strong emphasis on compassion and charity to those who are vulnerable in society, and I think that like it's a common theme again in anime. The bad guys are usually the ones uh, who have no sense of no sense of kindness, or I think even like a kind of a silly anime like this one called Damachi, or is it wrong to pick up girls in the dungeon or something like that? It's a kind of a silly anime. They have season 3 is just out, and the guy has like probably too much compassion. He has like compassion for everyone. Everyone he sees this like in a hard state. He wants to help them out. The main character. He's a little bit of a simp, honestly, if I'm being real here. But I think that's the charity compassion angle is definitely there in Shinto. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is, which of course is a Christian virtue. You want to see this, so it's a good thing that this is in anime. You see very little actually iconography in Shintoism. There's a strong emphasis on nature, and that's because they believe that God has manifested himself, like I mentioned earlier, in these divine principles in nature. So they think like the kami of the water, like the kami of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji, this beautiful mountain, this ethereal mountain. They think that the essence of the mountain it shares some spiritual. There's some spiritual essence to it. So we see the mountain, and in this phenomenal sense in space and time. And then philosophy, we can talk about how does the mountain exist in and of itself outside space and time. And we can talk about qualia or some of these metaphysical concepts. And then Japan takes this principle and then they add a spiritual aspect to that, and rightfully so. All our metaphysical principles come from God. So yeah, and then they add a spiritual element to it, and they said, okay, there's some like spiritual deity that's like shares an essence with the mountain, but is kind of distinct from it. And so that is kind of like, and when we think of the mountain, when we think about venerating God, we think about this anthropomorphized spirit. And it's basically like a symbol. It's a symbol that we use, or that we use to help us understand the divine. We will never understand God. God is outside space, time, causality. He is infinitely more holy, intelligent than us. And he is divinely simple. The only way we can understand God is through analogy and through a study of aesthetics, and through by basically finding symbols that we can analogously predicate to God, and then through like an aesthetic relationship with these symbols. And so there's of course like the symbol part, which is probably more the intellectual side. Everything by what I'm saying, it comes from Immanuel Kant, by the way. So if you're interested in where I'm getting these ideas from, this comes from Kant's understanding of religions. He talked a little bit about paganism himself. But yeah, there's a lot of this symbolism is very important in religion. And basically what Kant says is that these symbols that we use, that they have this intellectual aspect to them, so that they're not just mere feelings. It's not just a mere like feeling that we're talking about here. There is something below the surface. There's some content to it. So, if we talk about, I don't know, if you're talking about like going to mass and you're just feeling a feeling, it's more than that, though. We have this symbol of like the Eucharist, and you have all these symbolic gestures with the incense. It's like prayers ascending into heaven. And so we have this aesthetic feeling that we sense, and we can kind of understand, okay, this feeling I get when I see this incense floating up to heaven, this is very similar to how God, this kind of feeling we can attribute to God. And then we can also see the symbol as the intellectual side of it. Hopefully that made sense. It looks like my computer's freezing up here, but it looks like I'm still recording okay, so. Who is Godzilla? I don't know much about Godzilla. I couldn't tell you that one. All right, looks like I'm back, though. I'm sorry if there was any technical issues there for people watching the live stream. So yeah, there's a really strong emphasis on nature in Shintoism is what I was getting at. That's kind of the way they see these how the cosmic principles played out. And I think that I think that's a good thing for all nationalists to be conservationist, to appreciate nature. That is our home. stop being bug people. So I think the natural landscape you see in anime, the rice fields or the fight scenes in like the mountains are very beautiful. There's a strong emphasis on the moon and the beauty of the moon. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the most beautiful parts of Shintoism that we can come to respect. That radiates from it is their emphasis on nature. I think that we in the West have really no sense of this, and we're in this an industrial society, and we just pollute. We're per capita, we're the biggest polluter. So yeah, it's probably not what we want. Even though it might help GDP, it might be good for the economy. I don't think it's good for our relationship to God. And whatnot. And so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say about Shintoism and about its virtues and about how this has manifested itself subconsciously, or perhaps there are animes about Shintoism. There's one, I forget what it's called, but it's about a god, one of the minor gods or something, and he's like trying to find friends, and it's a funny anime. I forget the name though. But there are explicitly Shinto animes, but just implicitly these tendencies, this traditional culture has infiltrated the genre. And that's why I think it is based. And that is why when I say anime simplicity is based, that's what I mean. It is a traditional, and it's also Zoomer too. It's your going around circumventing Hollywood, and that's what we want to do. We want to cut Hollywood down from their knees. So that is why I think, yeah, if you don't like anime for whatever reason you can't get into it, that's like fine. That's everyone has their own individuated taste, but that doesn't mean it's it doesn't mean it's no longer based. I think if you watch It's a Wonderful Life, that's a beautiful Christmas movie. I've talked about it on the show before, and how some of the American Puritan values have influenced that show. I would say it's a very similar thing. Perhaps Hollywood. Oh man, how long ago was that? That was like 1930s when that show came out, I think. No, 1940s. It was like late 1940s. So yeah, it's been quite some time, almost 80 years. No, not that long. Let's see. It was 1940, 30, 50 years, about 50 years. About 50 years. So yeah, it's been, because it's late 1940s, yeah, about 50 years ago. Maybe you could say Hollywood had similar themes. Because in It's a Wonderful Life, they have this beautiful scene with the church. Everyone's praying after World War II. Everyone prays. And when there was someone like George Bailey was going through this hard time, everyone's praying for him. So they existed in America. It's just America has been taken over by non-Americans, the entertainment industry, basically. And it's even worse. It's not just non-Americans. It's non-Americans they have no roots. They have no, now they have a home, but they didn't for thousands of years, almost 2,000 years, they didn't have a homeland. So, which means they're going to be more hostile to nationalism, more hostile to nativism and those impulses. And that's going to play out in certain proclivities of their own. So it's like what we see in Hollywood is the opposite of what we see in anime. In anime, they have proclivities or tendencies towards nationalism or some type of spiritism. And then in the West, we have Jewish elites who have proclivities. And yes, Jewish people do control Hollywood. I've went through the statistics on my show many times. They brag about this. It's not a secret. They like to say they don't control the media, and they'll come up with statistics for that. But they can't even deny their control of Hollywood. It's like all the major multimedia conglomerates, Disney, Viacom, CBS, they're all top to bottom. The producers, directors, they're all, they all share a certain ethnic line. And so, yeah, they share proclivities that are anti-American and anti-Christian. And I'll just leave, and I'll answer questions. But before I do, let me just leave you guys with this beautiful quote by Fritjof Schumann. I thought he did let me zoom in. But I thought he did a really good job with this quote. So I just wanted to read it. It's about, of course, probably the best part of anime is the anime women. I think we can all agree with that. Can I get an amen in chat? No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, waifus are awesome. They're very kawaii and feminine, as we mentioned, very pure. And so this is what Frithjof Schuon, the great perennial traditionalist philosopher, had to say about Japanese women. Much praise, and this is a quote here, quote, much praise has been given, and rightly so, to the qualities of the Japanese women. But what is forgotten by those who proclaim that her emancipation are the traditional conditions that formed her. The seeds are not, the sexes are not two races, the one tyrannical and the other tyrannized. Every woman has a father, just as every man has a mother. The Japanese woman would not be what she is had she not inherited the qualities of strength, authority, and discipline from her innumerable fathers, just as the Japanese man has benefited from the gentleness, patience, and self-sacrifice accumulated over the centuries by his mothers. So we see, again, the traditional gender role is very distinct here in Japan. And I like what Frithjof Schuon is saying here about that fact that both genders still benefit from these roles. It's not like the woman doesn't benefit from the father's discipline and vice versa. And let me continue the quote here. In quite a general way and outside the problem of metaphysical and psychological inequalities, when people speak of freedom, they too easily lose sight of the fact that freedom has value insofar as it allows us to realize our spiritual destiny, conformable with our nature. I love that line right there. Let me just read that again, if you don't mind, if you'll permit me. When people speak of freedom, they too easily lose sight of the fact that freedom has value insofar as it allows us to realize our spiritual destiny, conformable with our nature. Freedom is not a freedom of indifference. It's not a freedom to choose to be addicted to porn or not. Freedom is living rightly with God. And for Shintoism, it would be even like living in harmony with nature, in the natural world around us, in these cosmic, timeless, eternal, innumerable principles. Thank you guys for listening. That is the end of my monologue here. I will end this video went on for a lot longer than expected, so I'll end the recording. Thank you to those people who watched on YouTube. Make sure that you subscribe if you're not. And I'll see you guys next week.